Have you ever witnessed a moment so unbelievable that it left an entire crowd frozen in silence? Imagine spending years laughing at a quiet old bus driver, believing he was just another forgotten man trying to survive. No one knew who he really was. No one questioned why he never defended himself. But everything changed the moment a black limousine pulled up to the bus stop, and one of the richest men in America stepped out. What happened next stunned every passenger. The billionaire looked straight into the old driver's eyes, his voice trembling as he whispered just one word: "Dad." In that instant, decades of lies, heartbreak, and sacrifice came crashing into the open. The people who had mocked the old man only moments before suddenly realized they had judged a life they knew absolutely nothing about. But the truth behind their reunion was far more heartbreaking than anyone could have imagined. Before we uncover the story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoy emotional stories that remind us never to judge a person by appearances, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our next story. The city had already decided who Thomas Reed was. Every weekday at exactly 6:15 in the morning, the aging bus driver climbed into the same worn driver's seat, adjusted the cracked rearview mirror, and began another 12-hour shift through the crowded streets of Chicago. His uniform was spotless, though it had clearly been repaired more than once. His gray hair peeked out beneath his cap, and the deep lines on his face spoke of decades spent carrying burdens no one could see. To most people, Thomas was invisible. Some passengers barely looked at him. Others treated him as though he were part of the bus itself. A few were far worse. "Hey, old man." One college student laughed as he tossed a crumpled dollar onto the fare box. "You still driving this thing? I figured they'd have replaced you by now." His friends burst into laughter. Thomas simply smiled. "Have a good morning," he replied softly. The kindness in his voice only seemed to encourage them. People assumed his silence meant weakness. They never imagined it came from something far stronger. Every afternoon, after completing his route, Thomas walked 3 blocks to a quiet neighborhood park. He always carried the same faded leather satchel. Inside it were only 3 things: an old silver pocket watch that no longer worked, a worn photograph with faded edges, and a stack of handwritten letters tied together with a blue ribbon. Every evening, he sat on the same wooden bench, looked at the photograph for several minutes, then carefully returned everything to the satchel before heading home to a tiny apartment that overlooked the railway tracks. No visitors, no family, no phone calls, only silence. To the outside world, he looked like a lonely old man whose life had quietly passed him by. But appearances often hide the deepest truths. One rainy Thursday morning, the city seemed even more impatient than usual. Traffic stretched for blocks. People complained about being late. Passengers pushed each other while climbing aboard. Thomas greeted every single one with the same calm smile. "Good morning." Most ignored him. Near downtown, a sharply dressed businessman boarded the bus while arguing loudly on his phone. "This city is unbelievable," he shouted. "Do you know how much money I'm losing sitting in traffic?" Without looking up, he waved his expensive watch toward Thomas. "Can't you drive any faster?" Thomas answered gently. "I'll get everyone there as safely as I can, sir." The businessman rolled his eyes. "That's exactly why people stay poor. No urgency." Several passengers chuckled. Thomas said nothing. Minutes later, the bus approached a busy intersection. The traffic light had just turned green. Several cars accelerated. But Thomas didn't move. Instead, he pressed the brakes. Hard. Passengers lurched forward. "What are you doing?" someone yelled. The businessman exploded. "Have you completely lost your mind?" Before anyone could say another word, a speeding delivery truck ignored the red light and thundered across the intersection exactly where the bus would have been. It missed the front bumper by less than 2 feet. Silence. The entire bus froze. A mother instinctively hugged her little daughter. Someone quietly whispered, "Oh my God." If Thomas had accelerated the moment the light changed, dozens of lives would have been lost. The businessman slowly lowered his phone. For the first time all morning, he looked at the old driver with respect. Thomas simply released the brake, smiled gently, and continued driving as though nothing extraordinary had happened. None of the passengers realized that this wasn't the first time Thomas had quietly saved someone's life. And it wouldn't be the last. But somewhere across the city, a black limousine had just left the headquarters of one of America's largest companies. Inside sat billionaire Ethan Carter. He had canceled every meeting for the day, for the first time in 25 years. He wasn't searching for a business deal. He was searching for one man. A man everyone else believed was just an ordinary bus driver. Across the city, inside the top floor of Carter Global Holdings, the atmosphere was unlike any ordinary business day. Executives stood nervously around a 20-foot conference table, waiting for their CEO to begin the quarterly meeting. Instead, Ethan Carter remained silent. 41 years old, worth billions of dollars, and admired by millions, Ethan possessed everything money could buy. Luxury homes, private jets, Fortune magazine covers, awards from presidents. Yet every morning, before making a single business decision, he performed the same ritual. He unlocked the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside lay a faded photograph of a young man wearing a city bus driver's uniform, smiling beside a little boy no older than 6. The edges of the picture had nearly disappeared from years of being handled. Ethan traced the man's face with his thumb. "Where are you, Dad?" he whispered. No one in the company knew about the photograph. No one knew that despite building one of America's largest companies, Ethan had spent 25 years searching for the father he believed had abandoned him. According to his mother, Thomas Reed had walked out one rainy night without saying goodbye. She insisted he had chosen another life, another family, another future. As a little boy, Ethan cried himself to sleep waiting for footsteps that never came. At first, he believed his father would return. Then weeks became months. Months became years. Eventually, hope turned into anger. By the time Ethan was 18, he had convinced himself of one painful truth. My father didn't want me. That belief became the fuel behind everything he accomplished. Every business he built, every risk he took, every sleepless night. He promised himself that one day he would become so successful that the man who abandoned him would regret leaving. But success never filled the empty space inside his heart. Not even close. 3 weeks earlier, something unexpected had happened. An elderly woman named Margaret Lewis walked into Carter Global's headquarters asking to speak with Ethan personally. Security nearly turned her away. She carried nothing but a small envelope and insisted, "I have information about his father." Within minutes, Ethan invited her upstairs. Margaret sat quietly across from him, studying the billionaire's face. "You have his eyes," she said softly. Ethan's heartbeat quickened. "You knew my father?" She nodded. "I worked with him years ago." For the next hour, Margaret slowly unfolded a story Ethan had never heard before. Thomas hadn't abandoned his son. He had disappeared, but not by choice. Margaret explained that Thomas had once worked 2 jobs while raising Ethan alone after his wife became seriously ill. When medical bills piled up, Thomas borrowed money from dangerous people who promised quick financial help. They weren't bankers. They were loan sharks. When Thomas couldn't repay them, they threatened the only thing that mattered to him, his little boy. To protect Ethan, Thomas made the hardest decision any father could imagine. He disappeared. He wanted the criminals to believe he had left the city forever. Thomas believed that if they couldn't find him, they would never hurt his son. Ethan stared at Margaret in complete disbelief. "No." His voice cracked. "My mother told me." Margaret interrupted gently. "Your mother never knew the whole story." She slid an old newspaper clipping across the desk. It showed a younger Thomas Reed helping firefighters rescue children after an apartment building caught fire. Ethan recognized the face instantly. It was the same man from the photograph. The same smile. The same eyes. The same father he had spent 25 years blaming. Tears filled Ethan's eyes. "If everything you told me is true." Margaret reached into her purse. "There is one more thing." She placed a folded sheet of paper on the desk. It was a city transportation employee roster. Next to one name was today's route number. Thomas Reed. Active bus driver. Still working. Still alive. Ethan's hands trembled so violently that he almost dropped the paper. For 25 years, he had searched every state, hired private investigators, checked public records, spent millions trying to find one man. And all along, his father had been driving a city bus less than 15 miles from his office. Without another word, Ethan stood. He canceled every meeting, every interview, every business deal. Nothing else mattered anymore. "Prepare the car," he told his driver. "I'm bringing my father home." But neither Ethan nor Thomas knew. Someone else had been watching this reunion unfold from the shadows. And they had absolutely no intention of letting the truth come to light. The black limousine rolled quietly through downtown Chicago. Inside, Ethan Carter couldn't stop staring at the route number written on the transportation roster. Route 27. His father was somewhere on that route. Alive, breathing, completely unaware that his son had spent half his life searching for him. Every traffic light felt like an eternity. Every passing minute tightened the knot in Ethan's chest. His driver glanced into the rearview mirror. "Sir, are you all right?" Ethan swallowed hard. "I've negotiated billion-dollar mergers without breaking a sweat." His voice cracked. "But I have no idea what to say to my father." The driver said nothing. Some moments didn't need advice. Only silence. Across the city, Thomas continued his afternoon route exactly as he had done for decades. He greeted every passenger with the same warm smile. "Welcome aboard." A young mother struggled to lift a stroller. Before she could ask, Thomas stepped out of his seat and carefully helped her onto the bus. An elderly veteran climbed aboard using a cane. Thomas waited patiently until the man found a seat before pulling away. Nobody thanked him. Nobody noticed. Kindness had become such a natural part of Thomas's life that he no longer expected recognition. He simply believed it was the right thing to do. 3 stops later, the bus pulled up outside a busy financial district. As the doors opened, conversations inside the bus suddenly stopped. A long black limousine had parked directly beside the curb. People turned their heads. Several passengers lifted their phones. The rear door slowly opened. Out stepped Ethan Carter. Even those who didn't follow business news recognized him immediately. "Isn't that Ethan Carter? The billionaire? What's he doing here?" Within seconds, whispers spread across the bus. Thomas glanced through the windshield. He saw an elegantly dressed man walking toward him. Just another passenger, he assumed. He pressed the button. The front doors folded open. "Good afternoon," Thomas said kindly. Ethan climbed the first step, then the second. The moment their eyes met, time seemed to stop. Thomas looked into the face of a man he had not seen since that little boy was only 6 years old. The same blue eyes, the same gentle smile, only older, stronger. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. Passengers looked from one man to the other, confused by the silence. Ethan's breathing became unsteady. His hands trembled. Thomas searched the stranger's face. Something about him felt hauntingly familiar. Then Ethan smiled through tears. "You still wear Grandpa's watch." Thomas instinctively looked down at the old silver watch strapped around his wrist. Only one person had ever known where that watch came from. His son. Thomas slowly raised his eyes again. His lips began to tremble. Ethan." The billionaire couldn't hold back any longer. His voice broke. "Dad." The word echoed through the silent bus. Every passenger froze. The teenagers who had laughed at Thomas that morning stared in disbelief. The businessman who had mocked him lowered his head in embarrassment. Several people quietly put away their phones, realizing they were witnessing something deeply personal. Thomas stepped away from the driver's seat. His knees almost gave out. For 25 years, he had imagined this moment. Sometimes in dreams, sometimes in prayers, never believing it would actually happen. With tears streaming down his face, he reached out carefully, almost afraid the man standing before him might disappear. "Ethan." Before he could finish, his son wrapped both arms around him. The old bus driver broke down. Years of loneliness, years of regret, years of wondering whether his son hated him, all came crashing down in one overwhelming embrace. Passengers watched with tears in their eyes. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the city outside seemed quieter. After a long moment, Ethan stepped back just enough to look into his father's eyes. "I spent 25 years believing you abandoned me." Thomas closed his eyes. "I know, but I never stopped loving you." Ethan's voice shook. "Then why?" Thomas looked down at the floor. "There are things you don't know." Before he could explain, a loud voice suddenly interrupted from the back of the bus. "Don't believe a single word he says." Every head turned. A sharply dressed man in his 60s slowly stood from the last row. He removed his sunglasses. Thomas's face instantly turned pale. His hands began to shake. "No," he whispered. "It can't be you." The stranger smiled coldly. "Oh, Thomas, I've been looking for you for a very long time." The warmth of the reunion vanished in an instant. The past Thomas had spent 25 years trying to outrun, had finally caught up with him. The warmth that had filled the bus only seconds earlier vanished. Passengers who had been wiping away tears now stared toward the back of the bus in complete confusion. The stranger walked slowly down the aisle, his polished shoes echoing against the floor. He looked nothing like a criminal. Expensive tailored suit, silver cufflinks, perfectly combed gray hair. The kind of man people trusted the moment they saw him. But Thomas knew better. His breathing became shallow. "Ethan," he whispered. "Get off this bus." Ethan frowned. "What? Please, just go." The stranger chuckled. "Still trying to protect him after all these years?" Thomas clenched his fists. "You've done enough." The man smiled. "I disagree." He stopped just a few feet away. "You disappeared without saying goodbye. Do you have any idea how difficult you made my life?" Passengers exchanged confused glances. None of this made sense. One of the college students quietly whispered, "Who is this guy?" No one had an answer. The stranger slowly removed a pair of leather gloves. "My name is Victor Hale," he said calmly. "I suppose your son deserves to know who I am." Ethan stepped between the two men. "If you have something to say it to me." Victor nodded. "Fair enough." He looked directly into Ethan's eyes. 25 years ago, your father borrowed money from me." Gasps spread through the bus. Thomas lowered his head. "It wasn't for gambling. It wasn't for luxury." Victor continued. "It was for your mother's cancer treatments." Ethan's heart sank. "My mother?" Thomas looked at his son with tears in his eyes. "She was dying. I couldn't afford the surgeries. I would have done anything to save her." Victor folded his hands behind his back. "I gave him the money. With one condition. If Thomas missed a payment, I would collect another way." Ethan's face hardened. "You threatened my family." Victor didn't answer. His silence said enough. Thomas spoke quietly. "I worked 3 jobs. I sold our house. I sold everything we owned. I even stopped eating some days so you would never go hungry." Passengers who had mocked him earlier couldn't even look at him anymore. Thomas continued. "But no matter how hard I worked, the debt kept growing." Victor smiled without emotion. "Interest is expensive." One elderly passenger muttered. "You're a monster." Victor ignored him. The day Thomas finally admitted he couldn't pay, I offered him another deal. Thomas closed his eyes. I begged him not to. Victor continued anyway. "I told him he could disappear forever, or I would make sure his little boy paid the price." The entire bus fell silent. Every passenger understood. Thomas hadn't abandoned Ethan. He had sacrificed everything to keep him alive. Ethan felt the world around him collapsing. His childhood, his anger, his resentment. Every painful memory had been built on a lie. He slowly turned toward his father. "You let me hate you." Thomas nodded. "If hating me meant you stayed alive." A tear rolled down his weathered face. "Then it was worth it." Ethan's legs nearly gave way. All those birthdays, graduations, business victories. His wedding that never happened because he couldn't trust anyone. His obsession with success. Every decision had been shaped by believing he was unwanted. Yet the truth was far more painful. His father had loved him enough to lose him. One of the passengers began crying. Then another. Even the businessman who had mocked Thomas earlier quietly wiped away tears. The young college student who had laughed that morning stood up. I'm sorry." Thomas looked at him and smiled gently. "It's all right." "No." The young man shook his head. "I judged you without knowing anything about your life." Thomas placed a hand on his shoulder. "Most people do. They judge what they can see. Very few ever ask what someone has survived." Those words settled over the bus like a heavy silence. No one would ever forget them. Victor checked the time on his watch. "This has been touching, but sentiment doesn't erase debt." Ethan slowly turned. "What debt?" Victor smiled. "The one your father never finished paying." Thomas's eyes widened. "No." Victor reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick envelope. The original contract, with 25 years of accumulated interest. He handed the papers to Ethan. The billionaire glanced at the final page. His expression changed instantly. His jaw tightened. Passengers watched as he read the figure twice, unable to believe it. Someone finally asked, "How much is it?" Ethan looked up slowly. His voice was barely above a whisper. $53 million. A wave of disbelief swept through the bus. Some passengers laughed nervously, thinking it had to be a joke. But Victor wasn't smiling anymore. He was serious. Thomas looked at his son. "Don't." Ethan folded the contract carefully. "What do you mean?" "I won't let you pay it." Thomas stepped closer. "I spent 25 years protecting you. I'm not going to let you throw away your future because of my past." Ethan stared at his father for several seconds. Then, a slow smile appeared on his face. It wasn't the smile of a billionaire. It was the smile of a little boy who had finally found his father. You still don't understand, do you? Thomas looked confused. Ethan gently placed the contract back into Victor's hands. You think this story is about money. He took a deep breath. But you're about to discover that you've just made the biggest mistake of your life. Victor's confident smile began to fade. For the first time in decades, he realized he might not be the one in control anymore. Victor Hale let out a slow laugh. It echoed through the silent bus. The biggest mistake of my life. He adjusted his expensive suit jacket and looked at Ethan with a smirk. Young man, I've spent 40 years collecting debts. I've watched politicians, judges, and business owners beg me for mercy. He stepped closer. You think your money scares me? Ethan didn't answer. Instead, he carefully folded the contract and slipped it into his jacket pocket. His calmness unsettled Victor. The old loan shark had expected anger. He had expected threats. He had expected shouting. But Ethan's silence was something entirely different. It was confidence. Thomas grabbed his son's arm. Ethan, please. I don't want revenge. I just want this to end. Ethan looked at his father with gentle eyes. It will. But not the way he expects. He turned back toward Victor. For 25 years, you've believed you own my father's life. Victor smiled. I did. No. Ethan shook his head. You only owned his fear. Those words struck harder than any insult. Victor's smile faded. You don't know who you're dealing with. Ethan chuckled softly. I think I do. You've spent decades hiding behind fake companies, shell corporations, and people too afraid to testify against you. Victor's eyes narrowed. Be careful. Ethan took one step forward. No, you should be. The passengers watched in stunned silence. No one understood why the billionaire seemed so certain. Then Ethan reached into his pocket. Not for money. Not for a checkbook. For his phone. He pressed one button. Within seconds, a voice answered. Good afternoon, Mr. Carter. Ethan never took his eyes off Victor. Is Special Agent Daniels with you? Yes, sir. Put him on. Victor's confidence began to crack. Special Agent? The line clicked. Ethan. A calm voice answered. We've been waiting. I found him. Victor Hale is standing right in front of me. The color drained from Victor's face. For the first time since boarding the bus, he looked afraid. Thomas stared at his son. What is happening? Ethan smiled faintly. 3 years ago, one of my companies was approached by federal investigators. They believed someone had been laundering millions of dollars through construction firms. I agreed to help. Victor slowly took a step backward. No, Ethan continued. They never had enough evidence. They knew your name. They knew your businesses. They knew people were terrified of you. But they could never catch you. Victor suddenly turned toward the bus doors. I think we're done here. Before he could move another step, the sound of screeching tires echoed outside. One, then another, then several more. Passengers rushed to the windows. Black SUVs surrounded the bus from every direction. Men and women wearing jackets marked federal agents stepped out. Police vehicles blocked both ends of the street. Within seconds, the entire intersection was sealed. Victor whispered under his breath. No. The bus doors opened. A tall man wearing a navy jacket climbed aboard. He looked directly at Ethan. Mr. Carter. Ethan nodded. Agent Daniels. The two men shook hands. Victor couldn't believe what he was seeing. Agent Daniels turned toward him. Victor Hale. He pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt. For 27 years, you've avoided justice. But today, your luck ran out. Victor laughed nervously. You have nothing on me. Daniels smiled. I wouldn't be so sure. He reached into a briefcase handed to him by another agent. Inside were dozens of files. Bank records, property deeds, financial statements, witness testimonies, and one thick folder labeled Thomas Reed. Thomas frowned. My name. Daniels nodded. We've been investigating your disappearance for years. He opened the file. You weren't running from the law. You were running from him. Daniels pointed directly at Victor. We finally proved it. Victor's legs weakened. He looked around the bus. Every face staring back at him carried the same expression. Disgust. No one feared him anymore. The power he had enjoyed for decades disappeared in a single moment. As agents placed the handcuffs around his wrists, Victor looked at Thomas. You should have stayed hidden. Thomas met his eyes with a calmness Victor had never seen before. No, I should have trusted that the truth would find its way home. The agents escorted Victor off the bus. Outside, reporters had already begun gathering. Cameras flashed nonstop. Passengers looked at Thomas with a completely different expression now. Not pity, not amusement, respect. But Ethan wasn't looking at the reporters. He wasn't looking at the agents. He was looking at the man who had sacrificed everything so his son could have a future. And for the first time in 25 years, he finally understood what real wealth looked like. It wasn't measured in billions of dollars. It was measured by the sacrifices a father was willing to make for his child. But the greatest surprise of the day was still waiting for Thomas. Because before the sun set, his quiet, lonely life was about to change forever. As the federal agents drove Victor Hale away, the crowd outside the bus erupted into applause. Some passengers stepped off the bus in tears. Others stood frozen, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Television cameras surrounded the scene. Microphones stretched toward Ethan Carter. "Mr. Carter, is it true this is your father? Did you really find him after 25 years? Are you planning to sue Victor Hale?" Questions came from every direction, but Ethan ignored every reporter. Instead, he walked back onto the bus. Thomas was still standing beside the driver's seat, staring at the steering wheel as though none of this had happened. He looked completely overwhelmed. "This isn't real," Thomas whispered. "It feels like I'm dreaming." Ethan smiled. "If this is a dream." He gently placed his father's old driver's cap back on his head. "Then neither of us should wake up." Thomas laughed through tears. For the first time in decades, it wasn't a lonely laugh. It was the laugh of a father who had finally found his son again. The passengers began clapping. One by one, they stood from their seats. The applause grew louder. The young college student who had mocked Thomas earlier walked to the front of the bus. His eyes were red from crying. "Mr. Reed." Thomas looked at him. "I'm ashamed of how I treated you this morning. I judged you because of your job. I thought success was about money." He lowered his head. "But today you taught me that the richest person on this bus was never the billionaire. It was you." Thomas placed a gentle hand on the young man's shoulder. "Son, never be ashamed of admitting you were wrong. Be proud that you had the courage to change." The young man nodded, tears rolling down his cheeks. "I'll never forget you." News of the reunion spread across the country within hours. Television stations replayed the emotional embrace between father and son. Millions of people watched the footage online. Comments poured in from every corner of America. "I cried watching this. Never judge someone by their uniform. This restored my faith in humanity. Call your parents while you still can." By evening, Thomas Reed had become the most talked about man in the country. Yet none of that mattered to him. He had only one question. "Ethan." His voice was quiet. "Would you like to come home?" Ethan smiled. "I've waited 25 years to hear you ask me that." That evening, Ethan drove his father to the small apartment near the railway tracks. The billionaire looked around in disbelief. The walls were faded. The furniture was worn. The kitchen was barely large enough for one person. Thomas noticed his son's expression. "I'm sorry. I never had much." Ethan slowly turned toward him. "Dad." He looked around the tiny apartment once more, then back into his father's eyes. "You gave up your home, so I could have mine. You gave up your future, so I could have one. There is nothing in this apartment you should ever apologize for." Thomas's eyes filled with tears again. As Ethan explored the apartment, something caught his attention. The old leather satchel. The one Thomas carried to the park every evening. "What keeps you carrying this everywhere?" Thomas hesitated, then handed it to him. Ethan carefully opened the bag. Inside was the old silver pocket watch, the faded photograph, and the stack of handwritten letters tied together with a blue ribbon. "What are these?" Thomas smiled sadly. "I wrote one every year." Ethan looked confused. "Letters? For me?" Thomas nodded. "Every birthday, every Christmas, every graduation, every promotion I read about in the newspapers. I wrote to you. I just never mailed them." Ethan's hands trembled as he untied the blue ribbon. The first envelope was dated October 14th, 25 years earlier. On the front, in faded handwriting, were just 4 words. "To my beloved son." Ethan carefully unfolded the fragile paper. The room became silent. His eyes moved slowly across the page. Within seconds, tears began falling onto the letter. His father had never stopped loving him. Not for one day, not for one birthday, not for one Christmas. Every year, Thomas had written another letter, hoping that someday, somehow, his son would finally read them. Ethan looked up, unable to speak. Thomas smiled gently. "I didn't know if we'd ever meet again. So writing to you was the only way I could still be your father. At that moment, Ethan realized something that no amount of wealth could ever replace. His father hadn't missed 25 years because he didn't care. He had missed them because loving his son meant letting him go. And now, for the first time, they finally had a chance to make up for the years that had been stolen from them. But among those 25 letters, one sealed envelope remained untouched. It was different from all the others. Across the front, Thomas had written only one sentence. "Open this only after I'm gone." Ethan stared at the envelope. A chill ran through the room. What could possibly be inside? That his father had kept hidden all these years. The room fell silent. Ethan held the sealed envelope in both hands, unable to take his eyes off the faded handwriting. "Open this only after I'm gone." His heart pounded. He looked up at his father. "Dad, why would you write something like this?" Thomas gently took the envelope back and smiled. "Because there are some words a father hopes he'll never have to say goodbye with." He carefully placed the envelope back inside the satchel. "I prayed I'd get to tell you those things myself." Ethan nodded. "Then promise me something. Anything. When the day comes." He couldn't finish the sentence. Thomas reached over and squeezed his son's shoulder. "When that day comes, you'll know what to do." The following morning, Ethan woke before sunrise. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about board meetings or stock prices. He was thinking about breakfast. His father was already in the kitchen. The smell of pancakes filled the tiny apartment. Thomas stood at the stove wearing a faded blue apron. Ethan laughed. "I can't believe you're cooking." Thomas grinned. "I used to make these every Saturday. You'd always ask for extra syrup." Ethan's smile slowly faded. "I don't remember." Thomas didn't look disappointed. Instead, he placed a plate on the table. "That's all right. We have time to make new memories." As they ate together, Ethan noticed something. His father barely touched his own food. "You okay?" Thomas forced a smile. "I'm fine." But moments later, his hand began to shake. The coffee cup slipped from his fingers and shattered on the floor. "Dad." Thomas grabbed the edge of the table to steady himself. "I'm all right." Before he could finish, he collapsed. The ambulance arrived within minutes. Ethan sat beside his father, gripping his hand the entire ride. "Stay with me. I'm right here." Thomas managed a weak smile. "I've waited 25 years to hear you say that." At Mercy General Hospital, doctors rushed Thomas into the emergency department. Hours passed. Every minute felt longer than the last. Ethan paced the waiting room. The same man who had calmly negotiated billion-dollar deals now felt completely powerless. Money couldn't speed up time. Money couldn't ease fear. Money couldn't guarantee another tomorrow. Finally, a doctor walked through the doors. "Mr. Carter?" Ethan stood immediately. "How is he?" The doctor's expression was gentle. "Your father is stable." Ethan let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. But his heart sank. "There are some things we need to discuss." They stepped into a private consultation room. The doctor opened Thomas's medical file. "Your father has been receiving treatment for several years." Ethan frowned. "Treatment? He never told you?" Ethan slowly shook his head. The doctor sighed. "Thomas has advanced heart failure." The words hit Ethan like a freight train. "What?" "He was diagnosed almost 4 years ago. He chose not to undergo the surgery we recommended." Ethan stared in disbelief. "Why?" The doctor hesitated before answering. He said he wanted to spend whatever time he had left looking for his son. Ethan's knees nearly gave way. He knew. He knew he was dying? The doctor nodded. "He told us there was one thing more important than extending his life." "What?" The doctor smiled sadly. "Finding you." Tears streamed down Ethan's face. All those years, his father hadn't been waiting to die. He had been fighting to live long enough to see his son one more time. Later that evening, Ethan quietly entered Thomas's hospital room. The old bus driver looked exhausted, but his eyes lit up when he saw his son. "You came back." Ethan pulled a chair beside the bed. "I'm not going anywhere." Thomas smiled. "Good. Because there are still a few stories I owe you." Ethan reached for his father's hand. "No more secrets." "I promise." Thomas nodded. "No more secrets." He closed his eyes for a moment before speaking again. "You know, I never wanted you to become a billionaire." Ethan looked surprised. "I only wanted you to become a good man." Ethan lowered his head, overwhelmed with emotion. "I spent my whole life trying to become successful." Thomas squeezed his hand. "And you did. But success isn't measured by the size of your bank account. It's measured by how many lives become better because you lived. Those words settled deep into Ethan's heart. They would become the foundation of every decision he made from that day forward. But neither of them noticed the figure standing just outside the hospital room. A woman in her early 70s. She clutched an old newspaper clipping in trembling hands. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she looked through the small window. She whispered just 4 words. He finally found him. The nurse approached her gently. "Ma'am, do you know Mr. Reed?" The woman nodded. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "I've been waiting 25 years to tell them the truth about their mother." The nurse's eyes widened. "What truth?" The woman looked once more toward Thomas's room. "The truth that could change everything they believe about the past." She took a slow breath. "And if Thomas survives, he deserves to hear it from me." The following morning, the first rays of sunlight filtered through the hospital window. Thomas Reed was awake. For the first time in decades, he didn't feel alone. Ethan sat beside his bed, still wearing yesterday's suit. He hadn't gone home. He hadn't slept. He simply sat there, watching his father breathe. Thomas smiled weakly. "You know, you snore." Ethan laughed. "I've been waiting 25 years to hear you tease me." The room filled with a warmth neither of them had known in a lifetime. Then came a soft knock at the door. A nurse stepped inside. "Mr. Reed, there's someone here asking to see you." Thomas frowned. "Who is it?" The nurse hesitated. "She says her name is Eleanor Brooks." Thomas's smile vanished. His face turned pale. "Eleanor." He whispered the name as if it belonged to another lifetime. Ethan noticed the sudden change. "You know her?" Thomas nodded slowly. "I haven't seen Eleanor in over 25 years." Before either man could say another word, the hospital door slowly opened. A woman in her early 70s stepped inside. She carried a small leather handbag and an old newspaper clipping folded neatly in her hands. The moment her eyes met Thomas's, she burst into tears. "Oh, Thomas. I prayed I'd find you before it was too late." Thomas struggled to sit upright. "Eleanor, what are you doing here?" She walked toward the bed, her hands trembling. "I'm here because I can't carry this secret anymore." Ethan quietly stood. "I'll give you two some privacy." "No." Eleanor stopped him. "You need to hear this too." She turned to Ethan. "I knew your mother." Ethan's heartbeat quickened. "You knew my mother?" She nodded. "We worked together at Mercy General Hospital." Thomas looked confused. "You never told me." "I couldn't." Eleanor lowered her eyes. "I promised someone I would stay silent." "Who?" "Your wife." The room became completely still. Ethan leaned forward. "My mother?" Eleanor nodded. "Yes." Thomas whispered. "But she died believing I abandoned both of them." A tear rolled down Eleanor's cheek. "No, Thomas. She never believed that." Thomas stared at her in disbelief. "What are you talking about?" Eleanor reached into her handbag and carefully removed a worn envelope. Its edges had yellowed with age. Across the front was written in delicate handwriting, "For Thomas, if I don't make it home." Thomas froze. He recognized the handwriting instantly. It belonged to his wife. His hands began to shake. This can't be." Eleanor nodded. "It was written the night before her final surgery." Thomas looked at her, confused. "Why didn't I ever receive it?" Eleanor closed her eyes. "Because I was a coward." The words hung heavily in the room. "I was supposed to give it to you the next morning. But before I could, you disappeared." Thomas lowered his head. "I had already gone into hiding." Eleanor nodded. "I searched for you. I searched for months. But no one knew where you'd gone." She looked toward Ethan. "Then your mother passed away. I kept the letter, believing one day I'd find Thomas." She sighed deeply. "But years became decades. And every birthday, I hated myself for failing both of you." Silence filled the room. The only sound was the steady rhythm of the heart monitor. Thomas carefully took the envelope. His fingers trembled so badly that Ethan gently helped him open it. Inside was a single handwritten letter. Thomas unfolded it with extraordinary care. His eyes filled with tears before he even began reading. "My dear Thomas, if you're reading this, then God has already called me home. I need you to promise me something. Don't blame yourself. You gave me more love than most people experience in a lifetime. I know you'll try to carry this family on your shoulders, but you don't have to carry it alone. Raise Ethan to become the kind man you've always been. And if life ever separates you from him, promise me you'll never stop believing he'll find his way back to you." Thomas couldn't continue. His vision blurred with tears. Ethan gently took the letter and read the remaining lines aloud. I've watched you sacrifice everything for us. You've skipped meals so I could eat. You've worked until your hands bled. You've loved us without ever asking for anything in return. If Ethan ever questions your love, tell him the truth. He deserves to know that his father was the bravest man I ever knew." The room fell silent. Thomas covered his face and wept openly. For 25 years, he had believed his wife died, thinking he abandoned their family. Now he finally knew the truth. She had understood everything. She had never doubted his love. Ethan wrapped his arms around his father once again. "You were never alone, Dad." Thomas nodded through tears. "No, I just didn't know it." As the three of them sat together in silence, none of them noticed a television in the hospital hallway. The news was breaking. Federal investigators have announced that Victor Hale's arrest has led to the discovery of evidence connected to dozens of unsolved disappearances and financial crimes dating back more than 30 years. The reporter paused before adding one final sentence. "And investigators say there may be one more victim whose identity has yet to be revealed." When Ethan heard those words from the hallway, a strange feeling settled over him. Something told him their family story wasn't over yet. The news spread across America faster than anyone expected. Every major television network carried the same headline: "Billionaire reunites with father after 25 years. Exposes one of the nation's most notorious loan sharks." People weren't just talking about Victor Hale. They were talking about Thomas Reed, the quiet bus driver who had spent decades serving strangers while carrying a pain no one could imagine. Within days, thousands of messages flooded the city's transportation office. Former passengers wanted to tell their stories. Stories no one had ever heard before. "I was 16, one woman wrote. I forgot my bus fare after school. Mr. Reed paid it without saying a word." Another message read, "I lost my job during the recession. Every morning, he'd leave a cup of coffee on the dashboard and pretend someone else had forgotten it. Years later, I realized he had been buying it for me." A retired soldier shared, "When I came home from overseas, I struggled with nightmares. Mr. Reed never asked questions. He just listened whenever I needed someone to talk to." Then came a letter that made Ethan stop reading. It was from a young doctor. 20 years earlier, she had been a frightened 12-year-old girl whose mother couldn't afford the bus to the children's hospital. Thomas quietly paid for their rides every week for nearly 6 months. Because of those rides, the little girl never missed a single chemotherapy appointment. Today, she was one of the country's leading pediatric oncologists. At the bottom of her letter she wrote, "If Mr. Reed hadn't helped my mother, I might not be alive today. Every child I've saved since then is part of his legacy." Ethan lowered the letter, tears filling his eyes. His father had never told him any of this. Thomas had changed hundreds of lives, without expecting anyone to remember his name. Meanwhile, Victor Hale sat alone in a federal detention center. The confident man who once controlled lives through fear now looked exhausted. Across the table sat Special Agent Daniels. A recorder rested between them. Daniels slid a thick folder across the table. "Your empire is over. Victor didn't touch it. You've frozen every account, every property, every offshore company." Daniels nodded. "And every witness you threatened has started talking." Victor remained silent. Then Daniels placed one final photograph on the table. It showed Thomas Reed standing beside his city bus, smiling at a little boy who had just climbed aboard. "Do you know why you lost?" Victor looked at the picture. "No." Daniels leaned forward. "Because you spent your entire life believing fear was stronger than kindness." He paused. "You were wrong. For the first time in decades." Victor had nothing to say. A week later, Thomas was discharged from the hospital. Doctors insisted he avoid stress. Ethan insisted on something else. "No buses." Thomas smiled. "I've been driving buses longer than you've been alive." "I know, but you've spent your whole life taking care of everyone else." "It's my turn." Thomas laughed. "I suppose fathers don't get to argue with billionaire sons." The next Saturday morning, Ethan drove his father downtown. "I thought we were going to breakfast," Thomas said. "We are. But there's one stop first." As they turned the corner toward the city square, Thomas noticed hundreds of people gathered outside the transportation headquarters. Television cameras, city officials, bus drivers in full uniform, children holding handmade signs. He frowned. "What's all this?" Ethan smiled, but said nothing. The car stopped. As soon as Thomas stepped out, the crowd erupted into applause. Not polite applause, the kind that comes from the heart. People stood cheering. Some wiped away tears. Others simply smiled at the man they had overlooked for so many years. Thomas looked around in complete disbelief. What's happening? The city's transportation commissioner walked to the microphone. For 38 years, Thomas Reed has done far more than drive a bus. He carried hope. He carried kindness. He carried people through some of the hardest days of their lives. And today, we finally have the privilege of saying, thank you. The crowd applauded even louder. Then something happened that Thomas never expected. The young college student who had mocked him on the bus stepped onto the stage. His voice shook as he spoke. Mr. Reed, I judged you because I thought your uniform defined your worth. I couldn't have been more wrong. He looked out at the crowd. Today I want everyone to know that because of you, I've changed. I've applied to volunteer at our city's homeless shelter. I want to spend my life helping people, the way you help strangers every single day. Thomas couldn't hold back his tears. He embraced the young man as the crowd watched in silence. Sometimes, one act of kindness doesn't just change a life. It changes generations. Then Ethan stepped to the podium. The crowd fell quiet. He looked at his father before speaking. When people ask me how I built a billion-dollar company, they expect me to talk about business. They expect me to talk about investments. He smiled. But the greatest investment I ever witnessed wasn't made with money. It was made by a bus driver who sacrificed everything he had for someone he loved. He turned toward Thomas. Dad, you spent your life carrying this city. Now it's our turn to carry you. The crowd rose to its feet once again. But Ethan wasn't finished. There is one more announcement. He reached into his jacket and unfolded a document. Beginning today, the Thomas and Grace Reed Foundation will erase medical debt for struggling families and provide free transportation to children receiving life-saving treatment. A gasp swept through the audience. No parent, Ethan continued, his voice breaking, should ever have to choose between saving their child and keeping their family together. Thomas covered his face with both hands. This wasn't just a gift. It was the healing of a wound that had lasted 25 years. As father and son embraced once more, thousands of people applauded. Yet deep inside, Thomas was thinking about something else. The sealed letter. The one Ethan had promised not to open until after he was gone. Because somehow, Thomas knew, that day was drawing closer than anyone wanted to admit. The weeks that followed changed Thomas Reed's life forever. For the first time in more than 25 years, he wasn't waking up before sunrise to drive a city bus. Instead, he woke to the sound of laughter. His son's laughter. The house Ethan had insisted they share was beautiful beyond anything Thomas had ever imagined. But it wasn't the marble floors or the breathtaking view that amazed him. It was breakfast. Every morning at exactly 7 o'clock, Ethan would walk into the kitchen carrying 2 mugs of coffee. Morning, Dad. Thomas smiled every single time. It was such a simple greeting. Yet for him, it was 25 years of lost mornings finally being returned. One afternoon, Ethan walked into the living room carrying a small wooden box. I have something to show you. Thomas adjusted his glasses. What is it? Ethan carefully opened the box. Inside lay a shiny brass key. Thomas frowned. A key. Ethan grinned. Not just any key. He helped his father into the car. An hour later, they arrived at an enormous warehouse on the edge of the city. As the doors slowly rolled open, Thomas stopped walking. His eyes filled with tears. Parked in the center of the building was Route 27. His bus, completely restored. Every scratch had been repaired. Every seat replaced. The faded blue paint had been brought back to life. Even the steering wheel looked exactly as it had on Thomas's very first day driving it. Thomas covered his mouth. No. Ethan smiled. Yes. I bought it from the city. I couldn't let them scrap it. Thomas slowly walked toward the bus. His trembling fingers touched the front bumper. He climbed aboard, ran his hand along the driver's seat. Everything was exactly where he remembered it. He sat behind the wheel one last time. For several long moments. He said nothing. Then he quietly whispered, "Welcome aboard." The words echoed through the empty bus. Ethan stood silently behind him. He knew those words had greeted hundreds of thousands of people over nearly 4 decades. Some of those passengers had forgotten the ride before they reached home. But none of them had forgotten the man who welcomed them. Months passed. The Thomas and Grace Reed Foundation grew faster than anyone expected. Families drowning in medical debt suddenly received letters saying their balances had been erased. Children traveling to cancer hospitals rode free. Thousands of bus drivers across America volunteered to help the program. When reporters asked Ethan why he had invested hundreds of millions into the foundation, his answer never changed. I'm simply continuing the work my father started, one passenger at a time. One crisp autumn afternoon, Thomas asked Ethan for a favor. Would you take me to the park? The one where I used to sit. Ethan nodded. They drove to the small neighborhood park where Thomas had spent countless evenings alone. The old wooden bench was still there. Thomas smiled. I spent years sitting here, thinking I'd never see you again. Ethan sat beside him. I'm sorry I wasn't here. Thomas shook his head gently. You were exactly where you needed to be. If I had raised you with bitterness, you would have grown into a bitter man. But life gave you compassion, and compassion is worth more than wealth. The two sat quietly, watching children play in the distance. Finally, Thomas reached into his coat pocket. He removed the old leather satchel. Inside was the sealed envelope. He held it for a moment, then placed it in Ethan's hands. I think it's time. Ethan looked confused. But you told me. Thomas smiled. I know what I said. But some gifts shouldn't have to wait until goodbye. You've already become the man I prayed you'd become. So I don't want my last words hidden inside a letter. I want to tell you while I still can. Ethan slowly set the envelope aside. I don't care about the letter. I'd rather hear your voice. Thomas's eyes filled with tears. Thank you. He took a deep breath. Ethan, promise me something. Anything. When people remember me, I don't want them to remember the man who lost 25 years. I want them to remember the man who never stopped loving. Ethan nodded, unable to speak. And promise me one more thing. What is it? If someone ever climbs onto one of your buses, or walks into one of your offices, looking tired, looking broken, looking forgotten, treat them with kindness. Because you never know. They may be carrying a story too painful for words. Ethan wiped away a tear. I promise. Thomas smiled. No. He corrected softly. Promise as my son. Ethan took both of his father's hands. I promise, Dad. I'll spend the rest of my life making you proud. Thomas looked toward the setting sun. A peaceful smile spread across his face. You already have. The wind rustled through the autumn leaves. For a long while, neither father nor son spoke. They didn't need to. Some moments are too precious for words. Neither of them realized that this quiet afternoon together would become the memory Ethan treasured most for the rest of his life. Winter arrived quietly in Chicago. Snow covered the streets Thomas Reed had driven for nearly 4 decades. The city looked peaceful, almost as if it knew one of its greatest servants was preparing for his final journey. Over the previous months, Thomas's health had slowly declined. Some days he felt strong enough to walk through the park. Other days, simply climbing the stairs left him exhausted. Yet he never complained. Not once. Every morning, Ethan sat beside his father with a cup of coffee, just as Thomas had once dreamed. Every evening, they shared stories about the years they had lost. It wasn't enough to make up for 25 years, but it was enough to heal them. One snowy evening, Thomas called softly from his bedroom. Ethan. His son hurried inside. I'm here. Thomas smiled weakly. I think it's time. Ethan immediately shook his head. No, we're not having this conversation. Thomas reached for his hand. My son, you can't stop every train from reaching its station. Tears filled Ethan's eyes. I just found you, and you always will. Thomas's voice was calm. Love doesn't end when someone leaves this world. It simply changes where we have to look for them. The room fell silent. The only sound was the gentle ticking of the old silver pocket watch resting on the bedside table. The very watch that had survived every hardship with Thomas. He removed it and placed it into Ethan's hands. This belonged to your grandfather. Then it belonged to me. Now, it belongs to you. Ethan closed his fingers around the watch. I'll treasure it forever. Thomas smiled. I know. Early the next morning, with the first rays of sunlight shining through the window, Thomas Reed quietly closed his eyes. His breathing slowed. Then, peacefully, surrounded by the sun he had loved every single day of his life, he slipped away. There was no fear, no regret, only peace. Ethan rested his forehead against his father's hand, unable to speak, unable to imagine a world without him. Yet somehow, he also knew his father had left this world exactly the way he had lived in it, with love. News of Thomas's passing spread across the nation. The city declared a day of remembrance. Thousands gathered outside the transportation depot. Every city bus stopped for exactly 1 minute. Drivers stepped outside, removed their caps, and stood in silence. Passengers didn't complain. No one honked. The entire city paused for the man who had quietly carried it for 38 years. A week later, the funeral was unlike anything Chicago had ever seen. Bus drivers from across the country formed an honor guard. Children whose medical treatments had been paid for by the Thomas and Grace Reed Foundation carried white flowers. Doctors, teachers, police officers, construction workers, single mothers, retired veterans. Thousands of lives touched by one humble man. Many had never even met each other. Yet every one of them had a story. I wouldn't be alive without him. He gave me hope. He reminded me kindness still exists. As Ethan listened, he realized something extraordinary. His father had never been famous. He had never been wealthy. Yet somehow, he had become unforgettable. That evening, Ethan returned alone to the little park bench where his father had spent so many lonely evenings. Snowflakes drifted gently through the air. Beside him sat the old leather satchel. For a long time, he simply stared at the final unopened envelope. Across the front, his father's handwriting remained clear. "Open this only after I'm gone." With trembling hands, he broke the seal. Inside was one final letter. He unfolded it carefully. His father's familiar handwriting filled the page. "My dear Ethan, if you're reading this, then don't waste today crying for me. Smile, because against all odds, we found each other. That is more than many fathers and sons are ever given. If I taught you anything, I hope it wasn't how to drive a bus. I hope it was how to carry people. Some will need your money. Many will need your kindness. All of them deserve your respect. Never measure a person's worth by the clothes they wear, the job they have, or the car they drive. The greatest people I ever met were those the world barely noticed. Remember something, my son. People will admire you because you're successful, but they will love you only if you're kind. And when your own journey finally ends, I hope someone can honestly say, because Ethan Carter lived, my life became a little brighter. If they do, then everything we lost will have been worth it. I love you. I always did. I always will. Dad." By the time Ethan reached the final line, the paper was soaked with tears. He looked toward the sky. For the first time since his father's passing, he smiled, not because the pain was gone, but because love had replaced regret. Years later, visitors entering the headquarters of the Thomas and Grace Reed Foundation were greeted by a life-sized bronze statue. It wasn't a statue of a billionaire. It wasn't a statue of a politician. It wasn't even a statue of a hero wearing a cape. It was an ordinary bus driver, standing beside an open bus door, one hand stretched forward, welcoming every stranger with the same words he had spoken thousands of times. "Welcome aboard." Beneath the statue, a simple plaque carried the message Thomas had lived by. Never judge someone by the seat they occupy today. You have no idea what road they traveled to get there. And every morning, before beginning work, Ethan would touch the old silver pocket watch in his pocket, look at his father's statue, and quietly whisper the words he wished he had said every day they were apart. "Good morning, Dad." The city moved on. The buses kept running. The seasons kept changing. But the kindness of one quiet bus driver never stopped traveling. As we come to the end of this unforgettable story, we're left with a powerful reminder that appearances can be deceiving. Thomas Reed wasn't remembered because he was wealthy or famous. He was remembered because he chose kindness when the world gave him every reason to become bitter. His greatest legacy wasn't the bus he drove or the sacrifices he made. It was the love he gave so freely, even when no one was watching. If this story touched your heart, let it be a reminder to treat every person you meet with compassion. You never know the battles they're fighting or the sacrifices they've made for the people they love. If you enjoyed this story, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next emotional story. Your support helps us continue bringing meaningful stories that inspire, uplift, and remind us of the best in humanity. Before you go, we'd love to hear from you in the comments. What lesson did this story teach you, and which moment touched your heart the most? Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, remember, kindness costs nothing, but it can change someone's life forever.